Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new Record Club episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea, and each week one of us picks a record for the other people to listen to, or the other person. And this week, we are finally tackling one of my longest-standing record clubs. Since the very beginning of this podcast, I've actually had this lined up. It's just been one of those things I've had in the reserves for a rainy day, so I've kind of put it to the backdrop. But today, we are finally talking about Ben Folds' Rockin the Suburbs, which is an album that we've periodically brought up over the years, just in reference to certain songs and certain things. I actually did mention it as being one of the first CDs that I ever owned when we did an earlier episode this year talking about the first CDs and albums that we ever bought or listened to. So this is a rather foundational album for me.
Absolutely.
And of course, it's been kind of a staple, I guess, in 2000s power pop and piano rock. This is an album that I wouldn't go as far as to say it's beloved, but I do think it's certainly very well liked in the upper pantheon of one Mr. Ben Folds' body of work. And if you don't know who Ben Folds is, which is understandable nowadays, just because he really did kind of drop off the map in the last kind of decade or so. His real ascendancy came in the mid to late 90s with his band Ben Folds 5, which were known for, their very wry sense of humor, very alt-rocky, sort of scrappy stuff that actually, funnily enough, until very recently, I had actually never heard a full record from, because I got fully acquainted with Ben Folds' solo stuff before Ben Folds 5, which, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I've been able to observe, is kind of the reverse of how it works for everybody else. Because, again, I listened to this album and then further explored albums of Ben's, like, for example, So There, or his collaboration with novelist Nick Hornby, Lonely Avenue, which I like both of those albums a fair bit. I think they're particularly underrated and underappreciated. But this is sort of right in the middle of Ben Folds, as that cultural ascendancy he had after albums like Whatever and Ever Amen, and was seen as a particular figure and fixture in this area of rock and pop music.
He cut across, I think, a lot of what was fashionable in the late 90s and sort of carved his own lane. What I always think about Ben Folds, specifically Ben Folds 5 as well, is, to me, it's like one of those bands that's just like so heavily influenced by like the Billy Joels and the Elton Johns, and the way in which sort of those solo artists would kind of construct a whole sort of personality and identity. And Ben Folds 5 and the music of Ben Folds 5 feels simultaneously indebted to that very 70s 80s singer-songwriter tradition, but also heavily infused with the kind of wry postmodernism of the 90s as well, that makes it feel very much of that time. It's kind of like dorm room core, to be honest. It's a sort of record that college guys doing English degrees would be, a sort of band that college guys doing English degrees in the late 90s early 2000s would be all over. And so Rockin the Suburbs is situated at a really interesting point as well, because this is Ben Folds' first solo album apart from that band, after the success of that band as well. And it really, in some ways, it functions as a more polished, higher budget version of essentially what Ben was already doing with his band. I mean, Ben Folds 5, which has always been like a funny band name because there's only 3 of them in the band, that was always kind of just Ben Folds' solo project anyway, not to discount the contributions of the other members of that band, but Ben was always the kind of songwriter, and it was always kind of his perspective that was being spoken from and on those records. And so Ben Folds coming out with a solo debut doesn't really mean all that much. But when you listen to it, especially if you compare it to some of those Ben Folds 5 records, you can sense a kind of step forward that Ben's taking in terms of embracing the success that he's been given, and how that has afforded him a little bit more money, a little bit more flexibility, freedom, and packaged with this, I suppose, desire for a wider success and being able to kind of embrace that possibility that was always there in his work, but was a little bit too sort of, esoteric, nerdy 90s to really kind of fully make that leap. And he really does here. I mean, this is, Jake, as you said, it's a piano rock album. Ben Folds known for his piano playing. It's kind of his most distinctive attribute that people are most likely to know him for. And you have a set of 12 songs here that are all piano led, that are all very immediate, that are all very punchy, that are produced with the slickness, but also with this minimalism that allows you to really focus on the power of Ben's voice, the economy of his storytelling as well, which is such a key part of this record. Yes, his wry sense of humor, which is most notably explored in the title track, which is the most well-known piece of media associated with this album, which we will get to, but also in the context of something that I think is more true to how most people perceive Ben, which is his personal character-driven storytelling and that sense of emotional immediacy that comes with his music. I think in a lot of ways, especially in terms of the sort of music that we tend to talk about on this show, what Ben does could maybe be seen as somewhat simplistic compared to some of the more, I guess, adventurous and ambitious and musically, comprehensive and strange and all those kinds of things that we typically tend to talk about. But having experienced it from a young age as well, and same with me, the immediacy of what Ben does, the emotional directness of what he does, the smartness and the slickness of the way he does it, and that added sprinkle of the self-aware sense of humor makes it a kind of irresistible package and a really, really fun album that doesn't really demand a lot of you to listen to, but also at the same time, when you do put it on, you can expect to have some real emotional wallops delivered in your direction. If you are willing to fully give it your attention, it will reward you in a big way for that.
Completely agree. I think that you brought up one thing that I think is essential to understanding this record, that being not only the economy of Ben's storytelling, but just the economy of the album in terms of its structure, both as an album and song by song structure. I think that this is like Ben's solo venture here. While somewhat indistinguishable from his previous work with Ben Folds 5, is that I feel like that work was notably a lot shaggier, both in sound and in structure. And that's a lot of the appeal of that band. But here it feels like there's an active effort to sort of refine and polish everything without sort of making it alienating or detracting from what makes Ben interesting as a songwriter. And as sort of one of those like late 90s, early 2000s songwriters, and sort of indulging in the sort of power pop dalliances that this album goes off in, I often compare this to the early work, at least, of something like Weezer, in that I think that both this and Pinkerton kind of have sort of a very quintessential, like you said, dorm room college guy sense of appeal to them. Whereas I think Ben really appeals to a more, I'm not trying to say this to like try and like prop him up and say that this is what's good about this album or bad about this, but it's a little bit more intellectual than something like Pinkerton. Not to say that it's like super high-minded or anything. A lot of what's appealing about this album is that it kind of has sort of a populist bent to it, but to appreciate all of the things that make it interesting, like its storytelling, its production, it takes a little bit more to, I think, fully grasp what makes this album as great as it is. As I mentioned in when talking about this album in our episode earlier this year, this is an album that ever since I heard it, it's remained kind of a permanent fixture in my life, and that I have gone few days in the last maybe 5 years without listening to at least one song from this album. So when I actually underwent the effort to listen to this for this episode, I did not expect to come away with my most fully formed opinion of this record to be that this is like a Pet Sounds tier pop masterpiece. And I think it is, honestly. Like, from a song to song basis, Ben has such a tight grasp on hooks, on songwriting, on sound, that every single moment of this is so vital. If I had to put forth what I think is the album that consistently has the best pop songwriting hooks of any album ever made, Ben Folds' Rockin the Suburbs might be my top choice for being the ones that are most memorable. Even the deep cuts on this album, every single one of them, hooks for days, burned into my brain. I mean,
that's such a, like, I'm not mocking that perspective, because I think I agree to a certain extent. It's such a great thing, like a great sentence to say, like just objectively, like Ben Folds Rockin the Suburbs has the greatest pop hooks of any album ever made. Look, it's one of those records that's so instantly gratifying that it's kind of hard to resist its charms. You have to be particularly cynical, I think, to be able to resist its charms. And certainly there is a bluntness to its directness that won't work for everyone, especially if you're someone like me who likes a little bit more of a wrinkle in your songwriting. But I still find Ben's charms irresistible here. And let's take a step back. Let's talk about the record itself. I think it's inescapable. I certainly, the way I encountered it, and I'm sure not just that dissimilar to the way you encountered it as well, as a child with the song Rockin the Suburbs. A number of different contexts with which people of our age might have encountered that song in its prime. I know some people encountered it in the context of the Over the Hedge soundtrack, where it was revised
That
heavily,
is, yep.
and rewritten, and is a very, very goofy little bit of pop culture ephemera. I remember specifically because as I grew up, perennially my dad always had music video channels on TV, and I was basically watching them constantly. And if there was a song that stuck out to my little child brain, I would let my dad know, and it would go on a VHS tape, and it would be repeated ad infinitum, specifically the music video and the song. And so I remember encountering the music video for Rockin the Suburbs, the title track on this album, as a kid, finding it to be the funniest fucking thing in the world. It's a really funny music video. And obviously,
And it still is.
I'm too young and stupid at this point to appreciate what the song is even about and what the song is actually doing. The fact that the song is this very tongue-in-cheek, gentle bit of mockery of a particular kind of male artist in the world of rock and roll at that particular point in history, particularly in the world of nu metal as well, taking some shots at Jonathan Davis and Fred Durst in particular, not by name, but I mean, very in the context of the lyrics, it's very clear. And that's the thing that makes the song really interesting. It's a blunt and very early 2000s bit of satire that is delivered with such a cheekiness that it's very hard to resist. And there's this sense as well, like, of being this, and I don't appreciate this just knowing this song. When you know the album, it becomes even more to appreciate how tongue-in-cheek this whole thing is as well. Ben deliberately dropping his piano rock based sensibility to adopt this, you know, big chunky riff chorus with this intensely cheesy breakdown at the very end, and this whole sense of just
a beat by DJ Swamp of Ministry.
This total sense of like complete off the wall irreverence, but packaged in this very chintzy and silly machismo that makes it just hilariously funny.
Pissed off, but I'm too polite when people break in the McDonald's line.
This is a song you kind of talk about in isolation because it's so different from everything else on the rest of the record that it's kind of a little bit of a misleading, I think, if you go approach this knowing this song like I did the first time I heard the album in full, expecting that kind of thing and getting something entirely different and much more emotional. So yeah, that song is just so iconic and so on its own island. I mean, there's elements of the humor in this song, like distant and small elements of the humor in this song that are peppered over the irreverence of Ben's perspective on other things on this record, but really that sheer naughtiness, for lack of a better word, is really isolated to this song, which is a classic, I think, but not representative of what makes this album great. What makes this album great? Already mentioned it already. We have to dig into it. The storytelling, the character world building. Again, the way in which Ben uses the immediacy of his arrangements, of the melodies, of the hooks, and of the production, all to emphasize the human reality and the connectability and relatability of the stories on this album. They are the thing that is most memorable about this record. They're the thing that is most involving and rewarding about this record as well. Jake, why don't you talk about some of your absolute favorite songs that do this on this album?
I do think every song on this album is more or less perfect. I think the opening 3-track run is a fantastic vertical slice of what makes this album so fantastic. You have the storytelling present in all 3 of these songs, a unique perspective on each of them, a unique tone to each of them as well, which makes each of them stand out, but there's not like there's enough variety to distinguish them from each other, but enough variety in and of themselves and enough solidly built arrangements and hooks to just sort of, guide you from place to place and from story to story just so effortlessly. You have like every instrumental idea on opener Annie Waits is a hook. You have that initial piano hook with a bum, 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 and then it goes right on from there. And I love the little subversion that happens in this song of where you're talking about waiting and eventually for this date, and then eventually getting stood up, and at the very end you have the Annie Waits and then the beat, but not for me. And it just purely and effortlessly like just distills what makes Ben an interesting, a funny, and a structurally ambitious songwriter. And then immediately you go into what I think is one of the best pop songs of the 2000s in the form of Zach and Sarah,
Agree.
because this is a song that upon each and every verse you get not only different like sonic details and different arrangements and hooks like I said before, but each sort of revelatory like piece of this song makes you like, it just adds a three-dimensionality to it that's so wonderful. It's this story of seemingly this very simple story of a young couple where the boy is going into a guitar store and playing on a PV amp in 1984, and just sort of like looking to shop for a guitar, and the girlfriend is just kind of listening to him. But you actually find out that the story in the song is more about the girlfriend as she sits there, and that it is very fucking dark, and that this girl has a lot of mental issues that get her, as the song details explicitly, smacked.
This is a great moment in the song when he just deliberately, because he's what Ben does that I love so much, like if I had to really kind of nail it down, is he uses very, you could say quite obvious, blunt, not exactly subtle or nuanced, and sometimes even quite hacky and cheesy techniques to manipulate you emotionally. But he does it with such a sort of po-faced directness and a conviction that it's impossible to resist. And there's just little things he does, little ways in which he establishes a very straightforward formula, very straightforward singing, rhyming, songwriting formula, and does these tiny little things to just upset the balance in ways that really leave an impact. And a great example of that is the way in which he sings about how Sarah has to deny the kinds of voices that she hears in her head because at home they get her smacked, and he says that in a way in which he upsets the rhythm of his singing and cuts the line short to have that word
Yes,
smacked deliver this extra impact. And it's a
he
small
got her
detail.
smacked.
It's a small detail, but he doesn't make a big thing out of it. He just uses it in this really cutting way to feel like you're being struck as a listener. You're being hit in that same way emotionally and
Yes.
psychologically. And it's so good as well. And the little details he uses on this song, the little bits of flavoring that he uses to make these characters feel more real. Zach without a C, Sarah without an H. That little bit of framing that just is so incidental, but adds so much reality and realistic. It just makes the characters feel more real in such an abstract and random reason. And I love everything about the song. I love the way that Ben uses his kind of trilling, very pretty and fanciful piano playing to kind of set this very warm and inviting atmosphere, and then kind of just let the song cut away from that into this kind of hand clap stomp format that makes it feel so sort of like, sort of like a little bit cheesy, a little bit like tongue-in-cheek, a little bit playful. And again, that's that contrast that adds so much to the emotional tone of the track as well. And that's something he does to a similar extent on Annie Waits as well. But it's like you get different variants of the story. You get variations in the extent to which Ben himself appears to be involved in these stories. Sometimes he is the one being stood up. Sometimes he's just this kind of godlike observer. And that is something that makes you sort of consistently aware of Ben's role as a storyteller, and to consistently questioning the extent to which Ben is maybe involved in these stories, or to which Ben is borrowing these stories from his own life. Not that that ever really matters, but it adds this dynamic to the whole world that Ben is constructing. And the whole thing feels so rich with these well-realized characters, particularly when you get songs like Fred Jones Part 2 and The Ascent of Stan back to back as well. These kind of very intimate and devastating character studies where so much of the life that these characters have led is sort of left off screen, so to speak, and left for you to kind of infer, and you're kind of coming into the show late and picking up the pieces in the way that Ben does. And he does these very great, very textbook sort of things you're taught really early on as a writer, but he uses them really, really well to get the audience involved in the stories that are being told, to get the audience asking questions based on information that they don't have, and to get the audience questioning the perspective that the narrator is kind of approaching these stories from as well. It's just all really great essential, foundational stuff. And I, the more cynical part of me when I was younger might have critiqued Ben for perhaps relying a little bit too heavily and laboring even some of the more basic foundational things that he does. But there is, I think, and I'm coming to appreciate this more as I get older, there is a real sense of nuance to it. There's a real sense of playful manipulation that happens throughout this record, and Ben is really, really good at doing it, so much so that you don't even necessarily always notice it. And that's one of the things I love so much about the way he tells stories.
I love too how he initially, once he complicates the narrative of a song like Zach and Sarah, he just delves into pure cosmic absurdism by invoking things like images from the novel 1984, and seeing the lights, seeing the pale English face, strange machines, repeating beats and thumping bass, and then it just circles back into where initially it started, and Zach finishing the song and Sarah clapping, and it's just a perfect little bow to put on this moment as a songwriter. And then after you get these initial two just perfectly written pop songs that are these wonderful character portraits with these tight vocal melodies and amazing piano arrangements, you get the emotional sucker punch of Still Fighting It, which is the moment where I feel like if you listen to this album because you heard Rockin the Suburbs, the song, which I did, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people did, when you hear Still Fighting It, this is the moment where you're like, oh, this is going to be a whole lot different than what I anticipated, because this is a song that it doesn't abandon Ben's penchant for irony, for humor, for wit, for all of these things, but he delves very, very far into the sincere emotionality of everything, where it sort of feels like he's talking to a version of his own child in this song, and talking about repeating the mistakes of his own childhood, his own past, and what it's like to get older and return back to a place where you feel disconnected from it. And it's just this mournful, nostalgic ballad, and it's this gorgeous sounding song. Like, again, the first two songs are wonderful sounding piano rock songs, but this is again where it both up the stakes emotionally and instrumentally, just because this is so full sounding, so rich, and just so like chilling, and it just catches you so off guard.
This is my favorite song on the record. It's my favorite Ben Folds song.
Amazing pick.
One of the things that that's come to really bolster my appreciation for this song is that, the first few times I've encountered it, because this is actually the only other song besides Rockin the Suburbs that I was familiar with before I heard the album. In fact, I remember this song from my childhood being in an anti-bullying PSA that I saw at some point in school. And it was just this, a terribly emotionally overwrought and traumatic, 3-minute PSA of this child getting just completely, torn to shreds by these older kids with this song backing it. And there was this, I guess, cynical part of my brain as a kid that associated this song with that kind of cheap emotional manipulation. And as I grew up and as I kind of kept encountering this song, and as my relationship with this album has developed over the years, I've come to really appreciate the fact that, yes, it's very emotionally blunt, and in some ways it's very sort of lyrically simplistic. But the reason it is that Ben is writing a song for a young child here. He's deliberately writing a song for someone who thinks and speaks and views the world through this particular lens. And it's a really hard thing to do without coming across condescending, or without coming across as though you are adopting the perspective of a child in a really sort of shallow way. But this is just like, it is a song where a father is comforting their son and is also kind of trying to prepare them, again, at a very young age, for the reality of what they might come to experience, with this implicit kind of implication that this person's not going to be around to support them for whatever reason, and that this child is maybe going to need to learn to accept and be able to survive the realities of the world without that support. And the fact that is just an implication that we don't really have any more information about that, but you just have this kind of subtle shade that this is a father preparing a son for a world that father is not going to be able to join the son in. It just adds this extra layer of complete emotional it just breaks me. It completely rips me into shreds and stamps on the remains. It's a really heartbreaking song, but it's also a song that resists being overly maudlin or saccharine or hitting these particularly cheap notes that songs like it could reach for. There's songs on this album that do the kind of cliche or overly ornate string arrangement sort of thing, but this is one of the songs that kind of resists heading down that lane and really just lets the intensity of those piano chords, especially on that chorus where you're just kind of left adrift with those heavily pounding notes and Ben's voice. He just lets that carry the intensity and doesn't feel the need to needlessly embellish it. And that's the thing that really sells it. And Ben, the way Ben plays piano on this as well, it's an attribute of many great piano rock records and of people who understand how to produce them, is the fact that the piano itself kind of functions in a similar way to how a guitar would function in a rock record. Like, it is hitting these really hard, really loud, sometimes staccato, but often just very violent chords in the same way that a guitar would hit riffs, or the guitar would play certain notes or hit certain chords to, form the basis of a song. Ben uses his piano and with basically the same function, and he's able to do it in a way that grabs you in the same way that a great rock record led by a traditional electric guitar would. And that's one of the things that makes it so inviting and appealing for people like us who are, who grew up on rock music, who are kind of attuned to, and real big fans of, that basic formula for rock music, but get to experience that with a slight twist and a slight sort of different approach in an album like this. That little, slight variant of something that is a tried and true formula that we love is one of the things that makes this so easy to come back to and so ridiculously listenable, because it's giving you something that you're basically DNA hardwired to enjoy, but it's tweaking that formula just a little bit to make it feel novel and to make it feel like it's giving you this really fresh approach to it. And the artist I thought of a lot while listening to this is an artist who was pretty big in the same sort of vein around the same sort of time, which is Ted Leo and the Pharmacists. Jake, I think you'd really enjoy their album Hearts of Oak from 2003, which is a very similar record, has a very similar intense approach to power pop songwriting and hooks.
Download that right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great album, and this reminds me of that a lot. But yeah, it's just this very particular thing that I feel like we don't get that much anymore, because the kind of directness and bluntness matched with that kind of irreverence, that sense of not necessarily feeling the need to adhere to taste, is something that's very far from the public consciousness now in terms of popular music, in terms of popular singer-songwriter music as well. I feel like Ben Folds' approach to singer-songwriter music is like the polar opposite of the approach of most singer-songwriters in most new records and bands that we talk about in the last few years. It's just so different. It's so distinct. It's so of a particular time that it, again, acquires this cachet and acquires this real attractiveness that makes it so exciting to come back to.
Yeah, I can't lie. Still Fighting, it's absolutely my favorite song on here as well. One of my probably 25 favorite songs ever. Because I encountered this so early, I've had to have a unique relationship with this album and this song, and that I kind of have experienced in real time, going from the point in my life where I would consider myself relating to the son in the song, and now to the point where I relate more to the father, which is just, again, really blindsides you when you listen to something like this, just because with a frankness with which some of these lines are delivered, like the sincerity with which he says it hurts to grow up, it sucks to grow up. It genuinely feels devastating when he says things like that, because you feel like, yeah, it fucking does, especially when you've undergone the kind of transformation and maturation that I have with this record. The best part of the song, though, for me, is just the bridge at the very end with the "it was pain, sunny days and rain, I knew you'd feel the same things." Like, that part just fucking Oh,
It's
Jesus. He just
it's
goes for the
taking
throat right there.
it's taking these emotions and these feelings that are so intense and complicated and difficult to express, and just distilling them down to sentiments that are almost obvious in how direct and they are, but only makes them more effective. Sometimes you just need to hear someone say, "It sucks to grow up," in a song that bangs like this, and that's all you need. There's no point in dressing that up anymore. And that's one of the things that's so appealing about Ben Folds, is that he finds ways to cut through the bullshit and give you an emotional hit that you didn't know you needed. And the record does this consistently beautifully throughout as well. Really a big fan of the song Carrying Kathy as well, which, you know, continues that sense, that
Yeah.
sort of maybe overly melodramatic narrative of Zack and Sarah, which I like slightly more in Zack and Sarah because of the kind of twisted psychedelic element of Sarah's psyche that the song kind of folds into. But Carrie and Kathy is beautiful in its own way as well. It has one of the best string arrangements and musical compositional arrangements of
Oh,
the entire album as well.
so good.
Breathtaking stuff. And of course, the narrative of this very mentally unwell person who consistently fails to get the support she needs. And also the fact that the song is sung from the perspective of someone who knows Kathy but doesn't understand her and doesn't really appreciate the reality of what she's experiencing, and can only really reduce her suffering to platitudes and to an even kind of condescending viewpoint that I think a lot of people who have loved ones who are suffering but don't understand that suffering and maybe don't appreciate the reality of it do adopt this kind of approach. While always someone carrying Kathy, there was always someone having to kind of pick her up and take care of her. This very, you know, insular viewpoint that really fails to account for the ugly reality of that lived experience. And so adopting that perspective really adds this edge to the song that makes it hit really, really hard.
Yeah, with all of these songs, with all these named characters, the sort of ethos of Rockin the Suburbs is that you get a really effective portrait of what I think the sort of mid 2000s were going to be like for a lot of American middle class people. Though, like, there's lots of stories on here that are about people getting fired, lots of stories of just general heartbreak, but lots of stories of just people going about living their lives. And it feels like, even it feels especially ahead of its time considering it came out in 2001, because it feels like it could have come out like right before the housing crisis came out, and it would have been perfectly nestled to sort of capitalize off of a lot of emotions that I feel like a lot of people were feeling then, which is the context under which I discovered the album. Which
Yeah.
is funny just because Rockin the Suburbs itself, the title track, feels like it's just in not only a satirical takedown of a lot of the musical ideas that he's sort of operating within, but also just the idea of existing as a very, you know, suburban middle class family. There's lots of ideas here that it's like, what if this person was a rock star? And it, you know, it goes into lyrical fucking venues of him talking about going to the store for preparation H and thinking that feeling bad or not feeling bad because slavery wasn't his idea, which is
Well,
such
here's the
funny
thing, right? Is
fucking
that
lyric.
it captures, you know, and this is almost a cliche because it's something a lot of songwriters have, you know, for millions of times and time again, a lot of songwriters take this approach of capturing a kind of malaise. And you get it here, particularly reflecting the end of the Clinton era, the start of the Bush era, the sense with which the 90s were so great, was seen as this kind of cultural step forward, basically. But that the ugly reality of that is that a lot of people were left behind, and a lot of things that were supposed to be really, really great never ended up being as great as people wanted them to be, or people believed that they would be. I mean, it's the same sort of thing you saw at the end of with the post-Obama era approach to art and songwriting as well. It's this kind of tale as old as time sort of thing. But it is mixed in with this interesting dynamic of prescience towards the Bush years. It's maybe not irrelevant to mention this is one of those albums like Jay-Z's The Blueprint and Bob Dylan's Love and Theft that came out on 9/11. Just
Very
almost like
gay.
the universe playing this kind of cosmic joke on these artists. But there is an aspect of the kind of cultural commentary to this record, and the sense with which it, whether intentionally or not, looks forward in really interesting ways that adds this wrinkle to it too. They're one of my favorite songs on the record, and I think one of the again, Pinnacle's songwriting wise is not the same, which again is
Yes.
being sort of singing or writing from the perspective of someone who is observing a change that is happening within the people around them, or is kind of observing one specific person around him who is having this basically kind of crisis within their life, and embraces Christ, and goes through all these changes, and Ben sort of looking on with this sort of bemused confusion and befuddlement. And there's this, and that's one of the things that I think carries through a lot of the songs in this album, which is this idea of wanting to understand but not being able to fully empathize, and not being able to fully put yourself in the perspective of someone else. Not that Ben feels he has this problem, but that Ben observes it in a lot of people. Ben observes this kind of insular sense of self-concern that robs and stops people from being able to fully understand others, being able to fully understand their suffering, their needs, their wants, their desires, their reality. And so a lot of the songs do end up being from the perspective either of a person who is distanced from the people around them because they can't see or understand the reality of what they're experiencing, or from that person themselves who feels alienated and feels as though the people that in their life don't understand them, and is kind of pushing them further into their own isolation as well. And that's a kind of the overarching theme of the record, I think. And I love the sequencing here, because you go from Losing Lisa, which is a song about Ben in a failed relationship, because again, there's this sense through the lyrics in the song that he doesn't really understand his partner or what they need. He kind of thinks that they're being selfish, but doesn't understand that maybe he's being a little bit selfish and not necessarily seeing the perspectives very clearly. Carrie and Kathy, the song about this horribly mentally unwell person whose family completely dismisses her and ignores her and sees her as a burden. Into Not the Same, which is this kind of more broadly talking about this perspective of someone who just feels befuddled and confused by the changes in the people around them, and sees the problem being within those people and not within themselves, not really knowing how to look inside. And then Rockin the Suburbs comes in as kind of like this far left field, taking this idea to its most extreme of, this complete insular macho stereotype, basically, who sees their own life as being at the center of the universe and their own sufferings as being greater than anything else. There's this journey the record goes on, climaxing at this point of complete, where Ben is just blowing up this overarching cultural narrative that he's observed, or tendency in the people that he sees around him, and taking it into this just completely just ridiculous extent. It's a really...
You just went to the store for some Preparation H.
Yeah, right. And he's not necessarily solely mocking that perspective. I think that what makes it powerful is that even though the song is ridiculously funny and really kind of poking fun at all of this, Ben obviously sees himself in that to some extent, and sees that the kind of blindness and the self-indulgence of that perspective is something that is universal and something that he's not exempt from. And that is why I think positioning this song so late in the record and letting it be this thing that you have so much new context for when you hear it on the album, as opposed to hearing it in isolation, makes it hit really hard. I will say that my one limitation with this album, and the one thing keeping me from loving it, I think, quite to the same extent as you, Jake, even though it's really an apples and oranges situation, is that I do think that...
I don't think anybody loves this album as much as I do, to be fair.
Yeah. I do think that the album kind of reaches this sort of apex, and with Rockin the Suburbs, in terms of having said all the things that I think it says really, really well, and then having this final sort of tongue-in-cheek exaggeration of that perspective, that the two songs that follow it can't help but feel a little bit less essential. I am partial to Fired. I particularly like the line in Fired where, this perspective of this really jaded person in the workplace who, just the observation, the one place, everywhere she goes, she says, "Everywhere I go, damn, there I am," which is just that line really messes me up for some reason. But I do think that these last two songs feel a little bit less essential, particularly The Luckiest, which is the one moment I think the album does get a little bit too shriekly and cheesy for me. I think it's just a personal taste thing. I think Ben navigates and avoids this excess really well throughout the record, and then he just kind of falls into that trap with this very hokey love song for his wife. especially when you get towards the end, when he gets into this fucking, next door there's an old man who lived in his 90s and passed away in his sleep, and then his wife died 2 days later. Like, come on, world's smallest violin playing here. I will give Ben a pass for it because his earnestness throughout this record is so endearing and so real. And of course, that earnestness is what makes the sheer mockery of the title track so much funnier and so much more real. But I do definitely think that I could do without The Luckiest personally. That said, it's a classic for a great reason. It's a record that we're celebrating because we love it. And it's a record that maybe deserves to have a little bit more of a reputation up with the greats, even if it is certainly of its time in a few distinct ways.
The Luckiest, to me, it's effective because it's about appreciating what you have, whereas a lot of the moments on this album that Ben still manages to find a lot of humanity in, like on Rockin the Suburbs, are so, callous in their disregard for all of the things that a person can take for granted. And you mentioned that line about the couple dying, but I love how he follows that up with it's not a subversion, but I'm sorry, I know that's a strange way to tell you that I know that we belong, that I know. It's just the tone of the song and the sort of stripped back and bare, just like soul piano ballad approach that this song has really just serves it as an effective counterpoint to the rest of the album, of Ben just sort of taking a moment to just be like, and he's been indulging in all of these perspectives that, while he has lent dimensionality to, have been very childish and very one-dimensional, very knowingly. So it feels like this chance he's taking to sort of step back and look at things with a little bit more of a holistic perspective feels a whole lot like, it just feels very cathartic to me. And it is maudlin, but I feel like it's maudlin in a way that makes sense within the context of the record. I frequently talk about albums on the show that kind of go a little bit off the deep end when it comes to their described theater kid energy. And I feel like Ben Folds is sort of the epitome of how an artist embodies that energy in ways that I personally get along with. We talked about albums last year, like Is a Real Boy by Say Anything. And I feel like that was just, it was a bit step too far in some instances for me to fully get along with what it was doing, despite the fact that, it is obviously an impressive bit of construction. Whereas here, I feel like the balancing act is walked a little bit tighter. Some other moments on here that I just want to shout out as being moments that stick out in my mind. Fred Jones Part 2 is a song that I absolutely fucking adore. It's actually a technical sequel to a song on Whatever and Ever Amen called Cigarette, which is a very, very minimal lyrical song about an older man who's sort of worried about smoking cigarettes because he's afraid that it's going to burn his house down because his wife, who's on too many drugs, won't be able to actually notice it. And I feel like there's an untold story in between Cigarette and Fred Jones Part 2 where this wife dies, and essentially, like, you could read it as being like it fulfilled that sort of fear that he had of his house could have burnt down, and he got a job and then went to live off on his own. And Fred Jones Part 2 is the story of the main character being fired and then going back home. And I absolutely love the imagery here of him putting on a slideshow of like his old memories and then trying to paint over them, and then taking the slideshow and then turning it off and then looking at the painting and then saying that it doesn't look quite right. Like, that's just such a fucking heartbreaking image.
That's one of my
devastating.
That's one of my favorite little bits of sort of tableau, or this little bit of imagery in the whole album, is that particular depiction and storytelling. And I mean, that kind of carries through into The Ascent of Stan as well, which ties into what I was saying before about this kind of increasing focus of being on the inability of people to fully understand the others that they observe and that they judge, and whose stories they can view through this distance lens. I think songs like Fred Jones Part 2 and The Luckiest, I suppose, function in the sense to try and kill the pessimism of that and kind of try and force the listener to reckon with the reality of someone's intense emotions, basically, and how beautiful they are to Ben. And so it is a kind of antidote to that cynicism. I didn't really get to talk about The Ascent of Stan, mainly because what I like about it is so true of the other songs. I've already talked about it, but just this idea of the kind of washed up old figure who's best years are behind them, but again, being viewed from the lens of this third person observer who doesn't really seem to fully understand the character in question and kind of judges them and views them through this lens that maybe dismisses or diminishes their achievements. It's this very, very subtle bit of perspective-based storytelling manipulation that adds this whole different dimension to the song that I love. Not to mention that Ben as a pianist and as an arranger is just, this is one of the most impressive songs on the record as well, along with Carrie and Kathy and Not the Same and Zach and Sarah. Yeah, there's just,
Beautiful.
we're at the point where everything is just great, basically. And despite the fact that I do have those issues with the way the record finishes, it certainly is true to the points that Ben is trying to make. So I can't ding points off of him for that personally. Yeah, it's just a great album. It deserves more love. If you're here, you probably already do love it. So keep spreading the good word, and let's hopefully get this record to the point where it is considered to be a classic, because it fully deserves it. And it is, I think, for as maybe simplistic or for as straightforward or for as po-faced as Ben's approach is here, there is a real emotional dynamism, a heaviness to the way that all of this hits that I think does put him in the company of the great songwriters that he's evoking, that he's clearly influenced by in his own way. So check this one out. It's an absolutely fantastic record, and we would love to hear what you think of it at home as well. Is it your favorite Ben Folds record? How does it stack up to the other Ben Folds 5 records and the other Ben Folds solo records? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Love hearing your takes, love hearing your perspectives, especially when they differ from ours. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Both those things help us out a lot. If you want to go above and beyond and support us directly, you can hit the join button for just $1 a month, become a member of the Jams and Tea family, get your name in the title call of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to listen to and talk about in our now episodes, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always, though, folks, until next time, rock over London, rock on Chicago, McDonald's, I'm loving it.